BBC analysis shows that 70% of NHS maternity units in England are failing to consistently meet safety standards, in part due to an ongoing shortage of midwives. In whole, scary, frightening figures. Staff numbers have risen by just 7% over the past decade. 2,500 posts remain vacant. The government says it is increasing training places through its NHS long-term workforce plan. Right, we need to talk about this. We're going to get the facts and figures. We're going to get people with direct experience in a maternity unit. And I'm going to talk to midwives, a former midwife and, two former midwives who've worked for the NHS. Lizzie, hello.
Hello.
Hi. You worked in the NHS as a midwife. You now work privately in the private sector. Is that correct?
I do, yeah. So I qualified in 2014. I've been a midwife for 13 years now in total. I started off in the NHS, so I did my training in the NHS for 2 years. Then I qualified and stayed there for another 2. I moved to London then, and I now work as a private midwife. And the reason why, just to sort of echo Hannah, is the reason actually why I moved privately in the first place is because I didn't feel like I could give the care that I'd been trained to give in the NHS. It was just too busy. And on the postnatal ward, I was sometimes looking after maybe 12, sometimes 16 women and their babies on my own. And I was running around all shift.
No auxiliary help. No auxiliary help. No one
there
senior.
There is auxiliary help.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so you've got healthcare assistants as well who can help with certain things, but there are a certain number of responsibilities that can only be fulfilled by midwives. So, for example, painkillers, pain relief, baby observations. It depends on the trust that you're working in, but sometimes you will have nursery nurses that can take on some of the levels of the jobs that need to be fulfilled. But it was just really hard because you'd be running around, then there is a bit of a blame culture as well. So if something isn't done, so for example, there could be a woman that's just had a cesarean section, she's just taken her anti-embolism stockings off to have a shower. You've then got a midwife that takes over for you on that shift, and then they'll put in a Daytex report on you just because that woman hasn't got anti-embolism stockings on. So there's a real blame culture out there because, say, for example, that woman then who's taken her anti-embolism stockings off has a deep vein thrombosis, then there's always like an apportion of blame. So I feel like as a midwife, I couldn't do it. And it got to the stage where I was like, well, I'm either going to have to leave this profession that I've worked really hard at university for 3 years to qualify, or I move into the private sector and hope that it's better there. So that's what I did.
Is it better in the private sector, and why, if so?
The ratios of patients to women is better, yes. So, for example, on a postnatal ward, you're probably looking after a maximum of 4 women and their babies. So, instead of 12 women or 16 women, that's like a third of the amount, which is a really big figure, to be honest, because the thing is with midwifery...
Sorry to interrupt. Do you think, then, that there is a significant increase in the level and quality of care that those 4 women are getting, like a noticeable increase in the level and quality of care?
Absolutely, because the thing is with midwifery is it's not just about the clinical procedures. It's not just going and throwing someone some paracetamol and walking away. It's about the emotional support. It's about having time to do proper breastfeeding support and speaking to these women, speaking to their families, asking them questions. How are you feeling? And there's just that is that holistic level of care that you just cannot give in the NHS. And it breaks our souls as midwives because it's such a massive profession, and people don't just go into midwifery to do a bad job. Like, we're caring people. We want to look after the people in our care. And it's just awful when you just feel like you've run around, you've done the bare necessities, you've written in everyone's notes, because obviously you have to do that to cover your own back. And that's basically it. So yes, definitely, I do see a big, massive difference. And also, when people are in labour, on a typical NHS ward, you're probably talking about 12 labour and delivery rooms. You've then got 2 probably emergency theatres, and you've probably got 2 anaesthetists on the labour ward. And what happens then is you get a backlog of people that want an epidural. They're all backing up. And I've been in a position before where I've been looking after a woman and she's wanted an epidural, and I've looked at the boards and I've thought, there's no way this woman's going to get an epidural before this baby comes out, because the 2 anaesthetists are in the emergency theatres. There's no way that they're going to come out. And even before my patient, there's another 3 that have requested an epidural on the delivery board. It's just awful. And you have to lie to these women and say, oh, the anaesthetist is coming, they're on their way. And you know that they're probably not going to get there before that lady delivers, whereas at least in the private sector, you call the anaesthetist and they come straight away.
These poor newly qualified midwives are expected to almost act like they've got 5 to 6 years experience, and they haven't, but they're expected to take the workload the same as someone who is experienced and able to multitask so much better.
Lizzie, do you agree with that?
Totally, yeah. What Hannah's saying is completely my experience as well. It's even student midwives, when they're qualifying, we don't have the time to really give them in terms of training them up properly. I remember when I was a student midwife and I was working in the NHS, you really do call on your mentor. You ask them questions. You need them to properly assess you when you're doing your clinical skills. And I just don't think the NHS at the moment has the capacity to fully, properly train up these student midwives. And actually, if you look at the figures, there's a lot of student midwives that aren't even reaching graduation, or they are reaching graduation, but they're not taking up jobs after they graduate because they see what it's like on the ground and they see all these midwives running around really stressed out and they just think, I can't do this for the rest of my life. They take up a post-grad job instead. So you've just got this massive shortfall, and I can't see it getting any better, to be honest, because we need the amount of qualified midwives that have been in the profession for many years. Like what Hannah said, a lot of those are reaching retirement now. There's a massive gap in the middle where people have just suffered extreme burnout and they've left the profession, and now there's band fives that do sort of survive. They have to take up the slack for it, and I just think it's only going to be a matter of time before they experience burnout as well.
I'll tell you what, talking to Hannah, particularly you, I mean, Lizzie, the NHS has lost you for the moment, I'm assuming. Would you ever go back, Lizzie, if the staffing rates did improve to what is acceptable, to what's needed?
It's a really hard one. I'm absolutely terrified of going back and working in the NHS. I really am. There was a situation that I can't go into details with, but it happened, and I was working just as a bank NHS midwife at the time, and I just thought, I can't go back
agency
there.
One, yeah.
Agency nurse, pretty much agency. And I just thought, I can't go back there. I'm going to end up losing my NMC pin, and it's not going to be because of any reason, because of what I've done. It's just going to be because there's a shortfall of staff, and that has led to this clinical situation happening. It's terrifying. It's really terrifying.
Were you able to flag that up? Were you able to flag that once you were there? I mean, I know you were an agency nurse there, so maybe, you weren't in the system, in that staffing system, but are there mechanisms to flag stuff like that up?
There's this DATEC system, which I talked about before. I think some trusts have it, some don't. But it's basically where if a clinical incident happens, then you submit a form with all the details on it. And then that goes then to higher management. And they've got clinical governance processes which kind of go through it, unpick it and learn lessons from it.
How long does that
They'll
take?
sometimes do a debrief with the staff.
One final question to Hannah. Would you ever go back as a midwife?
I think, you know what? Terrified is a perfect word for it, well said.
Which is what Lizzie said, yeah.
Absolutely. Lizzie said terrified, and that is a perfect word for it. At the moment, I am too terrified to go back. I do, as I say, I still love it.
What would change that?
I do agency. What would change it? I would have to see dramatic action from the government. Action in terms of just not just saying all these things. I think these reports are lovely, but I think it's the action that then comes from it. So how do we retain midwives? What our working structure that is expected of us?
Hannah, former midwife, Hannah Williams, thank you. Lizzie Romain, used to work in the NHS as a midwife, since moved to work in the private sector. Thank you. Thank you both for relaying your experiences.